right, welcome. So this video I want to talk about evolution. What is evolution? And we all might have an idea of what evolution is, at least from popular culture or popular science that we may have already had a chance to study. And I'm going to give you a particular perspective on evolution that is my perspective on evolution. And I am mostly trained as a computer scientist and a philosopher, and so I'm not officially trained as a biologist, though I've studied biology a lot in my life. So I come to evolution with the perspective of a computer scientist or a systems engineer, someone who likes to think of the world as systems. And that's the particular perspective I'm going to share with you today. So to start, I want to share with you a couple of the researchers that I think have influenced my understanding of evolution the most. And the first is this gentleman, Sir Richard Dawkins, who's quite well known as an evolutionary biologist, and he has now has writing on many other topics as well. This is one of his earlier books and one of his most important works. It's called The Selfish Gene. It was published in 1976. In this, he argues for a particular perspective on genes, but in this book, he also presents a fairly general, almost universal definition of what he thinks is required for evolution, and that's what I'm going to share with you here. So he says that evolution is a process of change, and that's something that's shared from most definitions of evolution. And then he stresses that what is changing are populations. That's also shared, but he brings the focus in on specific kind of populations of, he calls them replicators, specifically information replicators, things that replicate information. And then he says if you have a population of these replicators, whatever they might be, and that population has three important traits: that they have heredity, meaning that the information is replicated with some reliability. Then we might say that they have heredity. If there are maybe some errors made in that process, then you might get variation in the population, and that's also going to be an important property. And then the final one is selection, which is stressing that some of these information the information in these replicators is going to be important somehow to those replicators and their ability to replicate. Maybe they don't survive until they can replicate, or maybe with certain information they can replicate more or faster than their peers. These things are going to, these three traits, if you have them for a population of replicators, according to Richard Dawkins, should lead to evolution. And he says that this is the process that is in play in biology. All around us, biology are populations of information replicators, and he argues that they have these three properties. Let's take a chance to look at this idea in a little more detail. So I've just made a very simple example here. Let's imagine we have a world where there is a population of replicators, and they're just made out of colored shapes. So here I have our population here is just these four individuals. And we're going to assume that they can replicate, although I'm just replicating them in PowerPoint on my slides by doing a cut and paste. That's good enough for our idea, as long as we can give them these three traits. If we can give them these three traits, then maybe evolution can take hold. So the first one is, or the first one we're going to look at here is variation. We can see that the population I've already created displays variation. That is, each of the individuals in this population right now is composed of different colored shapes. Most of them have three shapes, but one of them only has two. Some have triangles, or most have triangles, one does not. We've got squares, circles, and of different colors. And we can imagine that that information, the kinds of shapes they have, maybe how many shapes they have, the color of the shapes they have, that's the information that's going to be replicated, and that's the information that hopefully will be relevant in their selection down the road. So here we have a varied population. Let's talk about replication. So I said I'm probably just going to cut and paste these. So when I decided I was going to replicate this particular individual from my population, I selected it out and I said, here's what the replication process is going to look like. I'm just going to cut and paste this individual over here, and that will be my new individual. And in this case, because cut and paste is not only reliable, it is perfect. It will cut and paste exactly what we had. So especially when the information that's relevant to us is only the shapes and their colors and maybe their arrangement in the structure, that when we cut and paste them, we're guaranteed that those properties are all going to remain the same. And so that's a very reliable cut and paste, or very reliable replication operator. And so we would definitely say that this population, and then combined with this replication operator of cut and paste, is a population now that has heredity. Normally, when we think about evolution, we don't think that our copying, our cut and pasting, if you will, is perfect like we've just done here. And in fact, it is more common for us to think of mutation or changes that are being applied as we copy and create our new offspring. So I'm going to introduce that idea also into this population. I'm going to say that sometimes when I choose to do a replication, I'm going to maybe change the new shape a little bit. Maybe I'll pick one of the shapes. In this case, I picked the circle shape in the middle there, and I decided I'm going to make some change to it. And I could have changed the shape or the color, or maybe both. I haven't strictly defined what my rules are. But the idea here is that after I do the cut and paste, I'm going to sometimes apply a mutation operator. Now, if we were developing this ourselves, we might try and decide on some specific chance of mutation, maybe 50% chance. Maybe I will do the cut and paste, and then I'll flip a coin, and then if the coin comes up heads, I'll decide to leave it as is, and if it comes up tails, maybe I will make some arbitrary random change to the shape. And of course, I'm not going to be that structured in this example. I just decided here I'm going to make a change for the example, and now I'll add those two elements back into the population. Now, the final thing we need if we're going to have evolution take hold is we need to have some kind of structure or rules about how our individuals in this population survive, and then also how our individuals reproduce. So I'm imagining now we could have some kind of game set up, maybe where we roll a dice or we pick out of a hat something like this, a red triangle, and when we do, maybe we decide, okay, you know, I'm not going to formalize these rules, but maybe in this case we decide, okay, red triangle, you can reproduce. And so in this case, this is sort of a selection procedure that now says, okay, any of the individuals that have red triangle, they're allowed to reproduce. So maybe we'll let our there's only one individual. In this case, I suggested maybe it mutated and grew another blue triangle on the end. And we can imagine this sort of going on, maybe following a fixed pattern, or like I said, maybe rolling a dice or picking out of a hat. We might then pick another one and say, okay, blue square, now you can reproduce, and that selects 3 of our agents, and so we can get 3 new agents. Again, some of them may be mutating as a result, others may be being perfect copies of their parents, and our population is growing. Now, so far, all we've just talked about is reproduction, but the other side of evolution is usually survival, meaning not all of the individuals are going to live forever, and so sometimes they're going to die. So maybe instead of just rolling a die or picking out of a hat and saying you can reproduce, every once in a while we also get a chance to die. And so we could get, maybe we pull out the hat, okay, green triangle die. That's pretty severe for the green triangles. That means all of the green triangles are going to die off, and we're going to be left with this population. And now we could just imagine if we continued this for a while, and specifically we would also need to make sure that this selection, so far what we've introduced is selection, but if I'm talking about rolling a dice or picking out of a hat, then the kind of selection that we've created is random selection, and that's not usually the kind of selection that we mean in evolution. We usually mean selection in some direction, whatever it might be, either guided by humans, that's artificial selection, that's what we do when we domesticate animals and so on, or natural selection. And those are the same ideas that we've got out here. Natural selection here is going to be a kind of unconscious selection that is applied by all kinds of things. It could be applied by other organisms. So it's the distinction between natural selection and artificial selection isn't that it's applied by some organisms. Wolves are organisms and they apply a natural selection pressure to their prey that might cause the prey to be faster or more vigilant or grow bigger, something like that. And we call that natural selection. Okay, and what is important about natural selection is that it is applied in nature by other natural organisms, or maybe just the environment in general, like rivers and mountains and so on, something about the environment. Those kind of pressures on an organism's survival and its ability to reproduce are going to naturally select those organisms into particular forms or niches, we sometimes call, that they can exploit, where they can live and thrive in that area, following that particular behavior pattern or growing into that particular shape. And artificial selection is something that we usually reserve to humans, but not always humans. After we've studied a bit, we've discovered that there are certain other species, often insect species like ants and termites and so on, that might also engage in what we might call a semi-conscious artificial selection on some of the other organisms that they have a mutualism with. But most of artificial selection, by the vast majority, at least in terms of what we like to study and talk about, is the kind of artificial selection that's been applied by humans to other organisms that we often now call our domesticated organisms. Those are organisms that have been subjected to artificial selection by humans and have resulted in usually a changing in the form and the structure of those organisms. So my example that I've got here is this is called a cladogram, and a cladogram is used by evolutionary biologists to plot their estimated splitting times between species and subspecies and so on. So the breeds of dogs that we have, modern breeds of dogs, have all evolved from wolves, and so we start out here in the left. We can see most of these little blue ones here. These are wolves, and these are the different kinds and breeds of wolves that you can find around the world. Now, I'm not an expert in dog evolution, but we can see that there are certain other kind of close to wolf things like coyotes, and there are a couple other dog-like creatures out in different parts of the world that are also very close to wolves, but are not necessarily wolves. But then the rest of this wheel, going all the way around the outside here, all of these are domesticated dog breeds that we have caused to emerge through artificial selection. That is, by deciding we like our dogs that look like this Doberman Pinscher over here, we were able to select for dogs that became Doberman Pinscher like. And then for other reasons, for instance, terriers, which is another breed of dog that were mostly used to catch rodents and such, similar jobs to what we would put domesticated cats to, you can see they kind of evolved to be little more cat-like dog creatures and so on. And so depending on the jobs that we may have put these creatures to, for another one are some of the herding dogs. Some of the herding dogs are also kind of shorter, tend to have shorter legs, and one of the reasons for that is they were less likely to get kicked in the face by the thing that they were herding if they were shorter. So there's lots of evolutionary reasons. Humans weren't necessarily saying we need the shorter ones so they don't get kicked in the face, or we need the more cat-like ones so that they're better at catching those rodents. What humans were doing were, well, let's select the ones that were good at catching rodents, and they just happened to be maybe the smaller ones, or they just, in terms of getting kicked in the face, if you get kicked in the face, you're probably not having too many offspring. And that may have not been necessarily artificial selection in the sense of humans deliberately doing anything. It was just humans putting them in a particular role, and that role had certain demands that caused them to evolve in a certain way. And so most of our different dog breeds, at least there's so many modern dog breeds, but some of the older dog breeds have all evolved due to the kinds of jobs that we put those dogs to. And modern we have started selecting them for other reasons as well, cosmetic reasons primarily, and in some cases also some behavioral reasons as well. And as a result, we've got a very, very broad range of domesticated dogs. And of course, the interesting and cool thing about this is they're all still the same species relative to the fact that we can interbreed them if we wanted to. This is an example, probably one of the best examples, at least visually, that we're all familiar with of artificial selection engaged in by human beings. But there is a tremendous amount of artificial selection that humans have done on plant species. Almost every single food source that we eat is a domesticated variant of some wild variant that we have domesticated over the last 10,000 years. One particular example that I like to bring up is the domesticated, I think it's called the mustard seed plant. That's the wild version, has been domesticated into broccoli, cauliflower, kale, cabbage, I believe, and I think a couple other vegetables as well. So by selecting that one plant, just like we did for wolves here, selecting the same plant into different directions, have given us different vegetables. And I always wondered when I was a child, I'm like, broccoli and cauliflower kind of seem like the same thing. And in the 90s, all of a sudden there was broccoli flower coming out, and I'm like, wait a second, what's going on here? Well, they're really all just the same species, just like dogs, and it was pretty easy for them to put some broccoli and cauliflower together to get something that was kind of in the in-between. So that's a sort of little introduction to how artificial selection works. That's humans playing the role of selection in that selection part of the evolution on naturally occurring information replicators that were already engaged in evolution. So the biological world was already engaging in natural selection, and humans came along to just sort of interject in and apply their own selection pressures in along with the natural selection pressures to get some desired results, and in some cases undesirable results as well. So we've just spent a little bit of time exploring the idea of heredity, variation, and selection in both an example population, but then also we just took a look at the biological world. And in the biological organisms, the replication, the thing that we're replicating, the information that we're replicating are genes, and the genes are encoded in DNA, which is a big long molecule or strand of DNA. Now there's some bias among biologists in particular, but also by most modern scientists, that we think that evolution is a biological thing, because that's where we first studied it, and that's where we first saw it, and we still study it primarily in that field. There's again just this tendency to maybe think, well, it's just a biological thing, but there has been an extent or part of the influence of Richard Dawkins and his book The Selfish Gene was to introduce the idea that maybe evolution could be more universal than that. And in fact, one of the things that Richard Dawkins actually introduced in that in his 1976 book is he coined the term meme. So he thought that his theory of replicators or information replication applied equally to the world of culture as it did to the world of genetics. And so he thought there must be like a gene, there must be some kind of unit of cultural transmission, whatever that might be, and he decided to give it a name, and he called it a meme. And in that time, in the 70s, it was he did this in one of the chapters of this book, one of the later chapters. So it was easy to just sort of overlook it if you didn't like that idea and think, okay, well, that's silly, and move on. And then later on, as his idea was picked up by some researchers, other researchers who thought it was not a very interesting idea at all really liked to get on board and say how dumb it was. And then when the internet arrived, and into the early 2000s, when we started spreading all these videos and images that were funny, and they would spread virally through the web, someone picked up on that word meme and decided, oh, that's what he was talking about. These are memes. These are the things he's talking about, the things that we spread around. And he kind of got vindicated, at least in the popular culture world. And his word meme now, even though that might not have been what he meant it to be, pictures of Keanu Reeves or whatever, he that's what memes are to us now, and he is the source of that word. And for us scientists who always, I've always thought the idea of memes was an interesting idea. We feel that this branch of cultural science, studying memes and how culture spreads and evolves, is a really rich field that has yet to been fully explored, and something that we can explore in more detail. Now, that's one of the contributions that Dawkins had from this book. The other being, as I've already reviewed, his theory of replicators. But the name or the title of the book, The Selfish Gene, comes from one of his primary theses in the book that he's trying to convince his readers of, which was an important revelation in the 70s, which is that genes are the ones that are really in charge of everything in the biological world, not us. We like to think that we humans are conscious and we drive our own decisions, but he would argue that it's our genes that have relinquished that control insofar as they have to us, and our genes are still really running the ship. And then he tells a lot of really compelling stories. This is a really easy to read book. It's one reason why it's still very popular and still on the bestsellers list in 50 years later. I definitely recommend going out and checking it out if you're interested in this material. But he argues that, the agenda of the gene is to just spread itself as much as it can, create as many copies of itself into the future as possible. And you can flash all the way back to the beginning of biological time, where maybe we were just genes in a pool, and it was just whichever gene could copy itself the fastest was the one that would take over the population, because it could push as many copies of itself into the future as possible, maybe dominating the resources in the little pool, so none of the other genes could copy themselves. And then over many, many years, millions of years, many, many eons and epochs of evolution, those genes have just gotten really better and better at copying themselves and pushing themselves into the future. And Dawkins wrote a handful of books about this topic. Again, very compelling books, easy to read, so I recommend them. The next one in the series is called The Extended Phenotype, where he goes on to say, if genes are the main things that are really driving the ship, and it's really their interests of just spreading themselves that are creating all of this wild biology life that's really interesting and cool, then what we can think of our bodies. We can think of this little beaver's body, or we can think of the body of any kind of organism as being kind of an elaborate support machinery for the genes. In a way, it's like a big, Dennett likes to call it like a big robot suit that you wear, that your genes are wearing. Your genes are kind of the drivers that are making the decision in what's going on, but everything else is a big old, robotic suit that protects the genes, and in particular protects some very special parts of your body, which is your reproductive organs. In our body, we have, millions, billions of cells, but most of those cells, when we die, are just going to decompose and go away. The only cells that could actually reproduce and push out into the future are our reproductive cells. And those cells are sort of like the queen ants of the colony. Okay, in an ant colony, all of the ants are sterile. They can't have any kids, but the queen is the one who has many, many, many kids. That's the same kind of organization in our body, and that's the main argument that he was trying to make in this book, is that that our genes have evolved over many, many eons and epochs to actually create very sophisticated creatures that they live in. The genes live inside these creatures, and the creatures go about their life ingesting resources and interacting with all kinds of other living things for only really one or two reasons. One is to survive, so don't die to those other things. They're trying to eat you too, just like you're trying to eat them. And then two, at some point, when you've got enough resources, make copies of yourself. Why? Because those copies have copies of genes in them, and that's all the genes care about. So at some point, go out there and create more copies of yourself. So the main argument is, yeah, our bodies and all of our non-reproductive cells, we call them somatic cells, all of those are just an elaborate construction for our genes' sake. But he extends it beyond that even further. Again, he starts in the animal world and he starts saying, well, it's not just the animal's body. The reason he's got a beaver on the cover of this is because beavers build these elaborate dams that change the flow of a river and create a pool that they can swim in and live in and eat and hunt in and so on. There's so many important things that they get out of that. But all of that is programmed into their genes. It's the genes that have decided, you know what would be better for us if we had a dam here. And how do they know how to engineer and design a dam? All of that has been programmed into their genes in some way through evolution over many, many years. So he argues that even the beaver dam there's genes for the beaver dam. Maybe you could probably do a genetic experiment and take those genes out, and the poor beavers might not know how to make a beaver dam anymore. And the same thing is for digging burrows, or there are certain kinds of snails that don't have shells. They build their shells out of rocks. So they build little homes to live in. Hermit crabs that do that same thing. They go out and steal the shells of other dead organisms to live in because they don't have their own protective shell. All of these different kinds of really cool biological adaptations are just ways that the genes are trying to protect themselves and extending themselves out into the environment. That's the main argument that he makes in this book. And I've put here in my slide here that it's not just our bodies, but it's our culture and our technology. So we as humans are experts in this, extending our phenotype out into the world. We put all kinds of things. There's a great book by a researcher named Andy Clark called Natural Born Cyborgs, where he argues that we have extended our brains out into the natural world. I'm sitting here staring at my phone thinking, how much of my brain have I really offloaded into that phone? Things that I know or should know that I don't really know. I've actually just stored them in that phone, and I just have a quick access way for me to do that. So all of these things are ways, well, I personally think that's how I keep track of my appointments this week and who I need to speak to. But my genes think, no, that's just a good way of me maybe propagating my genes into the future. Or perhaps, following Dawkins, it's my memes that like my phone. My memes really like the phone because it's through the phone that I can spread my memes faster. Okay, my genes, they don't spread very fast through a phone, okay, but my memes do. And so maybe it's the memes that are driving me at this point, and that's probably a good argument. So moving past the extended phenotype, if we accept that genes are this powerful that they can create all these different structures, then we start asking the question, well, where is this all coming from and who's in charge? And this was a much bigger question in the 80s, and it's kind of, evolutionary biologists today are pretty accepting of this particular principle. But in 1986, he wrote a book called The Blind Watchmaker to argue that, despite the crazy, complex, and cool things that you see out in the world that appear to have some really intelligent design, which is what the sort of the phrase that was used at the time, that how could such a beautiful bird that soars through the air with perfect aerodynamics ever exist if there wasn't an engineer somewhere designing that bird to soar through the air, which is it's a strong argument, I think, and a lot of people agree with it. Dawkins here, he didn't agree with it, and he said no one is guiding it. I think one important argument against that intelligent design is that the engineers who actually designed planes to soar through the air did it by looking at birds who actually soared through the air before. So the engineers aren't really that bright. They just kind of cut and pasted what they saw out in the world already. So that was designed by something else. And what was that other thing? It was the force of evolution. And so Dawkins' argument here in sort of the third book, if you want to think these are a trilogy, he has several more books, but I think these three is kind of a trilogy, His final one is, yeah, no one is guiding this evolution. There's no goal either. So even though that no one's guiding it, there's no final goal. It was also more common in the 80s for us to think, well, yeah, evolution, evolution is real, but evolution was just trying to make us because we're so awesome. The humans are the pinnacle or the goal of evolution. And now that they've got us, evolution can, is done its job. And he was arguing a little bit against that as well, saying there was no ultimate goal. But despite that, we can get some immensely complex systems that come out of this force of evolution. And the word complex, I should put a little bit of stress on that as well. The one thing that we do think changes or increases or goes up over time as evolution takes hold is complexity. The thing that we do keep getting more and more of is more complex things. And humans certainly are among the most complex organisms on Earth. Certainly an individual human is very complex for many reasons. Our brains are very complex and very interesting relative to other brains and nervous systems of other animals in the world. But then also our culture and our society is immensely complex compared to even other natural colonies and cultures that are really, really complex, like insect colonies, and then also other primate colonies like chimpanzees and gorillas and so on. Our culture is just immensely complex. So one of the most complex things that has ever arisen, at least in our part of the universe, is us and our brains and our ability to use them to shape our world. So despite that, we don't really, evolution does not need anyone driving the ship, and it doesn't have to have an ultimate goal in mind to drive the ship either. And that's sort of this extra point made in The Blind Watchmaker. So at this point, I do want to maybe shift from Richard Dawkins, who is an evolutionary biologist. I mentioned a British evolutionary biologist who's very influential, to one of his colleagues who is a philosopher and my preferred favorite philosopher, modern philosopher, Daniel Dennett. Daniel Dennett followed up this particular book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, a really great book. It says right here was published in 1995. So it sort of follows on that trend that was started by Dawkins. He picks up where Dawkins kind of left off a bit, and he adds a philosophical slant to it. And he makes this statement that evolution is an unconscious process of adaptation, similar to what Dawkins was saying about a process of change, undertaken by populations of living things in order to optimize survival and reproduction in their environment. Let's break this apart a little bit. So the first bit is evolution is an unconscious process. So he's picking up on the blind watchmaker bit from Dawkins, saying no one's guiding this ship. It's not conscious. We're not evolving because of some goal in mind. Process of adaptation. So that's the change over time. And that's something I haven't emphasized yet, but evolution is about change. Change happens over time, and change happens to things. What is the thing that it happens to? It happens to populations. That's something that came out of Dawkins. He was a little bit more broad. He said populations of information-bearing replicators. But Dennett, at least in this paraphrased definition, he's going to focus in on living things, even though he accepts what Dawkins said about the universality. I'll mention that in a second. But he focuses in on living things because living things, as we saw in an earlier video on life, living things have specific characteristics that we can draw on to, one, just understand what we're talking about in terms of evolution, but then also to emphasize particular things that are going to be important. Living things survive. Living things reproduce. And those are the things that evolution seems to be focused on, surviving and reproducing. And again, that's picking up off of Dawkins' lesson about the selfish gene, saying the genes are in charge and all they care about is, living long enough to copy themselves as many times as they can. And so this process of evolution is about optimizing this. Now, the one thing I do like that Dennis brings in here is the term optimize, because as a computer scientist, this is starting to bring in a particular aspect of evolution that's important, is that it is kind of algorithmic in one sense, and it's focused on optimizing in some way. The last bit I wanted to just bring up here is he also stresses the environment. And even though we were getting a little bit further away from our definition of an agent, remember when we were talking about living things, we said, oh, those are agent properties. A lot of the properties we're ascribing to living things that make them alive are agent properties. And I think that's what's kind of brought in here by the environment. For me, at least, when I see this, I'm reminded, oh, these things exist in an environment. That means they're agents. They sense and act on their environment. And that means that these are situated and embodied agents. And these are very important parts to intelligent researchers on intelligence, and then also in A-Life. We want to make sure that these agents that we're creating are situated and embodied, and I believe that that is what is being stressed here by Dennett in this part of the definition, and that by saying that they exist in their environment and they're trying to optimize their survival and reproduction within that environment, he's stressing that they are situated and embodied agents, and that evolution is something that happens to situated and embodied agents. So I mentioned that Dennett also does follow Dawkins' idea of memes. He really liked the idea of memes. And if there are two, main researchers that I would say sort of push this idea of memes, especially in the early days before memes evolved or emerged on the internet, it's these two, Daniel Dennett and Dawkins. They're the two that really believe in this idea. But the thing that I really love about this book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, and this is part of one of the main theses of the book, is that Dennett believes evolution is an algorithmic process. It transforms information. That was something we already got from Dawkins, but then he brings in, hey, what are the things that do transform information? Those are algorithms. We call those algorithms. Those are the things that computer scientists work on, and mathematicians. They use algorithms to transform information from one form into another. And hopefully, if you're a computer scientist listening to this, you're thinking, oh, wow, that sounds cool. That's exactly what happened to me when I was a student in college, and I started learning a little bit about genetics and evolution, and I started thinking, this sounds like a program. This sounds like something I could write. And sure enough, that started my own curiosity and led me into this field, or a specific field that I will talk about in our next video, which is the field of evolutionary algorithms. And that's the idea of writing an algorithm that mimics evolution to do something cool. And there's lots of things you can put it to, so that's why I'm being vague there, is to evolve something. Something in your program is going to evolve to do something, and that something depends on what you want. So there's lots of different things that you could put it to. So the last bit of this contribution, and I mentioned this, he's picking this up from the meme idea from Dawkins, is that other kinds of information, not just the biological information that living things have, can also reproduce, they can also replicate, and if they also satisfy our three properties, heredity, variation, and selection, then they can evolve. And his thesis is that culture and technology are also engaged in an evolutionary process. And Dennett here follows up this thesis that he outlines in Darwin's Dangerous Idea in a couple other books afterward, where he applies this to other concepts and principles of human life, like science and religion. So I just want to explore this idea that if evolution is a biological thing, but the algorithmic nature of it can be applied to other kinds of information, we might want to say, well, what other kinds of information could it apply to? So he's already recommended us here's culture and technology, and I want to look at a couple examples of that from our own culture and our own technology. So one thing that I kind of find fascinating, I do want to say thank you to Board Panda for making these nice graphics for me. This is a image of the evolution of the Coca-Cola logo from its original 1886 logo logo to today, or 2009 to today, one thing that is kind of cool about it that I like is it's kept the nice the writing, and that's something that we might all recognize, this script writing for the Coca-Cola logo that has stayed for many decades. But one thing that does keep changing, or the logo obviously keeps changing, and I want to bring our attention to why it might change. So for instance, you might notice that this first row they're all just black ink logos. Now, why might that be? Well, we might think, well, of course, before the 1940s, color print and color TV and all the color kinds of things that we enjoy today wasn't really common, and if those technologies had been invented, they were expensive, and so you had black and white logos. That's just how it was. Evolution, once those things became less expensive, or the technology started changing, we started being able to include color in. And then also, as our technology got better at rendering certain graphics, rendering certain shapes, we started getting different kind of stylization in there. So we start getting other words showing up. We start getting this swoosh showing up along with the Coke. Here's a cool throwback. Now, this was when New Coke, if you're old enough to remember New Coke, that was sort of a failed launch in the mid 80s, but they tried to rebuild their logo, but it still has some shape. I see some essence in here of the same kind of font from their original logo. Okay, and going back to that original logo, you might see that looks a lot like someone just typed that in a simple font and just threw a dash in there. That's probably what happened, because that was probably the most sophisticated technology back in 1886 that they could use to print logos and names. So they just picked a font that they liked, and there probably was 2 or 3 maybe that were available, and they used that. Okay, and so in 85, that was a bit of a throwback, but that's also an example of how evolution can sometimes go in waves, especially cultural evolution can pick up on something that was a few decades older and make it new again. Okay, so this is a cool, maybe one last thing I'll say is there's this one that sort of sticks out here in the bottom, the Coca-Cola logo with the bottle on it. That started to get into the age where we could do some computer-aided design, and there was there's certainly, when a new technology comes out, there becomes pressure to use it, and then you get sort of this surge of new material. And whenever you do get a surge of new things, especially in evolution, you get a whole bunch of new diversity out there. You get a whole bunch of selection, and after a few years, you don't have so much diversity anymore, because the popular things took over and became became dominant in the population. I'll maybe just end here by saying the final logo here kind of looks similar to one that's almost 100 years old. And one of the reasons is as our technology, so color became important, so you started getting more colorful logos. But then as color became common, we started to just assume that was normal. And so in modern days, there's a simplicity to our logos that we like. In fact, one thing that Coca-Cola does that a lot of modern corporations do not do is they still have their actual name on their logo. A lot of modern logos don't have any name at all. They are just a shape or an image or some kind of thing that you identify with a particular brand. And that is, if your brand is that easily recognized that you can just use a shape or something like that, then that's usually good. But Coca-Cola has a very recognizable logo because of its name and how it's written, and so they've held on to that for many years. I thought I'd just do one more example of that. This is the logo for Shell, the gas company. As I just mentioned, that many modern logos don't even have the name. As you can see, the modern version of this doesn't have the name, it's just a shell. One thing that I really like about this evolution is the very first one looks like a photo. In fact, the very first few look like photos. Again, in that period time, to us, they look awful and low res. In that period of time, they looked amazing because that was the best, highest res photo that existed. And so using a photo of an actual shell to us seems maybe tacky and poor design, but to them was amazing. It was using the most cutting edge technology of the time. Now, what you can start seeing by 1930, now we've got that stylization of the shell. So now graphic design is starting to become its own field, and they're saying, okay, let's take that and see if we can turn it into a reproducible logo, not just an image of a shell that we took. And then again, watch as that stylization becomes more and more stylized, more and more stylized. Now, looking at the final shape, is that a shell? Is that a sun? I'm not really sure, but to, you know, modern people pulling up to a gas station, they see that on the sign and they know exactly what it is, and that's what matters. Again, this is an evolution of technology, and the evolution of our culture, I should say, that brings us to a point where we don't even need to put the name on there, is representing a selection pressure relative to the population. That is, the population of humans that this image matters to already knows what it means, and so we can even drop the word off of it because they are so familiar with it. So again, that's just an interesting application of evolutionary principles to our culture, in this case, some logos that we've been using to represent corporations. Let's talk more about our technology, which was in play here, but here is a poster that I love to show about the evolution of the Ford Mustang. This one, I guess, is showing from 1964 to 2013. The reason why I want to show this is not only because it looks cool as like an evolutionary progression. If you scan through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and you get all the way down to the bottom, you will notice that from any one car to the next, they kind of look the same. You can probably, note, oh, here's a change we made here. Here's a change that was made there. Okay. But if you look more broadly from decade to decade, there are pretty significant changes. So big changes are made over a long period of time that are made out of small little changes that are made here and there. One thing that I think is important, or one thing that I like to share here, is the beginning of this evolution. You'll notice early on, we got a pretty standard looking car here in 1964, but by 1969, 1970, we're starting to get these cars. 1971, look at how long the front of this car is, and the back is sort of like this small bit. Now, the reason for this is in the 70s, you wanted to drive faster, and you wanted to have a more powerful vehicle. And to have a more powerful vehicle, you need to have a bigger engine, a more powerful engine that you could put in there. So the front of the cars started getting bigger and bigger to fit these bigger engines. And back then, now our cars are kind of made out of a lot of synthetic materials and so on. Back then, they were made out of a lot of metal, so it was a lot heavier. The outside was, a lot of steel and such, so you need a real powerful engine to drive that heavy car around at the speeds that you wanted to go. So we see that engine getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But when you get to about 74, okay, it looks like it's maybe the same size. 75, okay, it's getting smaller. 76, things are getting small. And by the time we get to 79, looks like a little old hatchback compared to 1972. 1979 is a tiny little shrinky car. So what happened? You might think, oh, well, maybe people just liked smaller cars by then. Well, actually what happened is there was an oil price and gasoline price crisis in the mid-70s, and as a result of that, all the car manufacturers, the big old long engine super gas guzzling cars were super expensive, and the customers weren't showing up to buy them anymore. And it may have taken a year or two for the engineers to realize this, but after a while they said, hey, no one's buying our big old gas guzzlers. We need to make some fuel efficient cars so that when they go to fill up their gas tank, it's going to be cheap on them. And so you start getting these smaller cars. Even this is a Mustang, right? This is still a sports car that's supposed to drive fast and be cool out there. Even by 1979, you've got the nice, cheap on gas version of that sports car. And again, you might be able to track more of those changes over time, but you can see that small engine kind of sticks around forever now because gas efficiency has become something that has become really important in our cars. And over time, the other thing we can't really tell just from these images are the changes in the materials that are being used to build the cars, that make them lighter, so that they are even more efficient on that gas. And again, this maybe stops at 2013, but we've been making changes in those engines now to make them more hybrid or even electric, so that they are, completely different technology in them, things that we might not be able to see here, but that are changes, evolutionary changes relative to what's going on in our culture. So our evolution or our technology also evolves. One cool thing about evolution of technology as well is we usually think of it as the free market that kind of decides, which cars are there going to be Mustangs made next year? That's up to the market. I believe there will, because these are pretty well-performing vehicles. But not all vehicles that existed, or all vehicle companies, or even brands or makes that existed in the 60s exist today. Certainly not all of them. And even ones that existed in the 90s and so on. Because of selection pressure, sure, it's selection pressure put by human beings through their wallet and deciding what they're going to buy. That's selection pressure in our market economy that causes certain cars to be more common on the roads and certain cars to be less common on the roads. And for that matter, the laws and the cultures of the lands also determine what cars you might see on the roads. In America, we see a lot of cars that are bigger, and that's because we have a lot further to go. We spend a lot more time in our cars, and there's also more space for us to have our cars here. We have a lot more space for parking lots and big old roads. In other nations like Japan or other areas like Europe, where there's not as much space and there's a lot better transit options than driving, you have usually a lot smaller cars. Why? Because you don't have a lot of space to keep them. You need to find a place to park them. And then also right on this road, you just don't have as much road space to get around, so you don't want to have a big old car. And so for all of these reasons, you see different kinds of, maybe species, if you like, of cars around the world that are well adapted to those parts of the world. And that is, we can think of that from an evolutionary standpoint. The last one that I wanted to look at here, because this helps us with a little bit of a branching, is the evolution of the iPhone and the iPad and the iPod. And I could go back even further with this, because all of these technologies, these are all just Apple technologies, and so this kind of looks like an ad, so I apologize for that. But all of these technologies were inspired by other technologies that had already existed. So before the original iPod, I know a lot of us have some selective memory and think, hey, that was the beginning of listening to sort of digital tracks. But really, for probably about a decade before the iPod launched, there were MP3 players of some kind. That's what we used to call them. You would just download some music from online, or you would, rip your CDs and you would compress them yourselves, and you would store them on these little players. And from that evolved the iPod. And the first iPod, in fact, what made it such an iconic piece of technology was what makes a lot of Apple technology iconic, is more of its presentation, its look and its feel. It kind of felt cool, looked cool. There were some really cool ads at the time. And the one thing that really made it popular at the time is Apple brokered the first deals with record companies to have a legal option for downloading music. Before that, all music downloading was basically in the legal gray area. But I wanted to take a look at this as though it looked like a cladogram, maybe like an evolutionary cladogram, where we would branch out and see different offspring, so we can watch as the iPod evolves, getting into different tools, different technology. The buttons are starting to change. We're starting to get this more touchscreen kind of feel. We noticed that the iPod actually branches out into an iPod Mini and an iPod Photo. And in fact, later on into an iPod Nano and an iPod Shuffle, all these different kinds of branches. I don't think all those iPods still exist anymore, because after some time, one of these branches, which turned into the iPod Touch, which that's starting to look like a cell phone to us, That particular branch led into the iPhone. Okay, now there's a whole other branch here of iPads that I haven't got on there, but we can see that that branch is in. This one's not made into the branch. This diagram that I've got here doesn't have them all branching out, but we can see that after, so we have iPhone, 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 iPhone. Now we have two iPhones. Okay, there's two different. I don't know the different kinds. I'm not an Apple user, so I don't know what they are. Then we have two kinds that are different sizes. Okay, in 2016 we ended up getting three different kinds. Okay, so we're seeing the technology that has become popular and in fact dominant is now branching out into different variants because there are niches. There are parts of the evolutionary world, in this case the market, that Apple wants to break into that prefer a bigger phone or an extra camera or whatever it might be on it, and they might be willing to pay more for it because otherwise all of the phones would be that way probably. And they've decided three different models is maybe the right way to go. And that means that this phone market is starting to enter into the same space that the car market's been in for many decades, which is there are many different sub-markets for different kinds of technology that basically do the same thing, drive you from A to B, or are your smartphone in your pocket. And because there are many different markets of it, you're going to want to put many different kinds, sub-kinds of that particular technology out into the world. So again, I hope you agree with Dawkins and Dennett and myself that culture is evolving, technology is evolving, okay, and hopefully these examples are relevant and convincing. And I'll leave you with one final observation that is relevant in the current day, which is 2023. We've recently had a uptick of AI technologies, things like ChatGPT for a chatbot, and then also Midjourney and technologies like that for image generation and audio generation and video generations right around the corner. And all of these technologies have sparked a debate about maybe we should stop this. Maybe we should stop making AI technology. There's a little fear around it, and I have to admit, I don't know what the right answer is. Is this going to be good for us or is this going to be bad for us? But as an evolutionary researcher, someone who studies the evolution of technology and the evolutionary of culture, it's a little bit proud of us to say we should stop this. I don't think you can stop evolution. Evolution, we've never been able to stop it before. We never said, hey, we had a recent pandemic. We couldn't stop the evolution of that. And it's unlikely that we're going to stop the evolution of AI. So maybe a better question that we can put, again, framing it from an evolutionary standpoint, is how do we adapt? How do we adapt so that we can survive and thrive in the new space with the new technology? All right. Thanks a lot for watching this video on evolution. I hope you enjoyed it. In my next video, I'm going to talk about evolutionary algorithms. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in that next video.